Hi, our group is M5, and my name is Asfan Shazad.
My name is Luisa Quintero.
And I'm Tanari Sandoval.
And I'm Liam Rooney.
And we will be going over the impact of COVID-19 on airlines supply chain.
We're going to start by going over the aerospace industry. About 1.2 million people around the world work in civil aerospace. This includes engineers, aircraft designers, and factory workers. Another 9 million people work for airlines, air navigation providers, and the rest are employed by airports. This means that all these jobs are dependent on people flying, and it's the reason that airlines stay profitable.
All right, so now we're going to go over the airline industry prior to COVID-19. So one of the major factors is their reliance on ancillary profits. So this will be non-ticket revenue, so baggage claims, food on the flights, things like that. And that's in 2019, that was reported as just over $96 billion. Another major factor is the fact that the global fleet was about 28,000 passenger aircrafts. So this is from all of the different airlines around the world. And just this past January, between the period of January and April of 2020, when COVID's scare was probably at the height, the overall fleet dropped by 70%. And in 2019, there were scheduled 10 million passenger flights overall. The airline industry also contributes to about 2.3% of the United States GDP. The US GDP in 2019 was just over $20 trillion, which brings in the airline's contribution at about $850 billion in economic activity. And that is directly related to tourism profits as beyond just the overall profitability of airlines themselves.
So the recent events from this year have devastated lives for many individuals. One of the major causes for these issues is COVID-19. Due to the pandemic, many businesses have closed their doors either temporarily or permanently. Some of the top industries affected negatively by the pandemic are retail, transportation, and travel industries. While some businesses are prospering during this time, most of them are seeing adverse effects. According to a study done by one of the Fortune 1000 companies, 94% of the Fortune 1000 companies are seeing supply chain disruptions from COVID-19, and 75% of these companies are seeing strongly negative impacts on their businesses. Air travel and other aeronautical businesses are one of the worst victims of this pandemic. The International Air Transportation Association projected that the US and Canadian airline industry could lose as much as $21.1 billion in revenue due to COVID.
I'm now going to discuss diminishing profits for airlines. The airline industry has seen a dramatic change in the demand of both business and recreational travel due to the travel bans imposed by governments trying to prevent the spread of COVID-19. The same travel restrictions, along with the fear of national, international travel, has pushed families to either refrain from traveling or to just travel locally. There's a preconceived notion that COVID-19 is spread through traveling. That's why people have wanted to cut back on traveling overall. These behaviors may stay the same post-pandemic, reducing airplane travel dramatically and causing a decrease in profits for the airline industry. The decline in demand for aerospace industry has seen a decrease in demand for flights results in reduction of order for aircraft supplies. Engines, wheels, brakes, computer systems, and aircraft components have all seen a reduction. GE Aviation and Rolls-Royce made job cuts due to the decline in supply demand. These cuts have affected the industry's supply chains, and small businesses are at risk of collapse.
A supply chain is a set of parties involved in fulfilling a customer's order. It consists of flow of information, products, and funds. To make supply chain more efficient, the companies must reduce the cost and increase the revenue. And to do this, the companies must gather the data from their customers and build relationships with suppliers who are reliable and economical. Airlines have seen some of the worst disruptions in their supply chains. It is not just the major companies such as Airbus and Boeing that are affected. The suppliers and maintenance companies are taking a big hit as well after many of their aircrafts have been grounded. Production and test facilities are closing. Workforce is hesitant to come in with concerns of contracting the virus. Boeing, which is one of the world's largest aerospace company and a leading manufacturer of aircrafts, is also suffering from the effects of the pandemic. They had to resort to asking the federal government for a $60 billion aid package for all the aerospace industry.
The supply chain of aerospace can be broken down into several tiers. At the top, we have OEMs, or original equipment manufacturers. In many cases, OEMs in the aerospace industry are also considered to be Tier 1 companies. Tier 1 companies are companies that directly support the OEM by being in charge of designing, manufacturing, and integrating complete systems or subsystems for the OEM. Main aerospace systems are generally engines, landing gears, avionics, fuel management, etc. Tier 2 companies are responsible for parts manufacture or subsystems assembly. They receive components from Tier 3 and send their final products to Tier 1 companies. These companies are usually smaller in size and magnitude and less technically equipped than Tier 1. Tier 3 companies are typically component manufacturers that will ship their products directly to Tier 2 companies in order to manufacture the requested parts. The picture below shows the supply chain flows within the aerospace industry. Tier 3 suppliers make components and source them to Tier 2 suppliers who build smaller subsystems. Tier 2 companies then sell to Tier 1, and they're in charge of final assembly of products for OEMs. Lastly, OEMs sell products to their customers and clients.
To reduce cost, it is essential for companies to be wary of their inventory, especially for the companies suffering during this pandemic. Inventory decisions are very important since inventory is basically money sitting around. Excess inventory can cost companies a large sum of money, and so can low inventory, which is known as opportunity cost. Airlines have the options of either purchasing aircrafts or leasing them. While leasing aircrafts is a better model for an airline, it also has some negative outcomes. A lessor will still require the lease payments for the planes even if the airlines are not using them. While on the other hand, if a company owns the aircrafts, it will cost them a lot of money to maintain them. Um, Older planes will be less fuel efficient compared to the new planes that are being leased. The aircrafts owned by the airlines will lead to uh, risk of product obsolescence. The suppliers that cannot send their supplies to be used by manufacturers will suffer from physical storage costs, among other expenses. This cycle inventory causes the companies to incur holding costs, which during normal times is easily taken care of, but is now hurting the companies because the inventory has no use during the pandemic.
Next, we'll get into risk management. The first thing is high inventory holding costs. So basically, since planes aren't able to be in the air, they have to be stored. And this takes up large amounts of space and is often extremely expensive. Many aircraft companies are deferred to parking planes out in the desert, where it can cost up to $30,000 per plane just to hold them there. This doesn't even take into account storage, machinery upkeep for the aircrafts. They also have a heavy reliance on minimal disruption. The airline industry hasn't seen a major disruption since 9/11, but COVID-19 took this to a new level that I think they weren't prepared for, and made it so that they weren't able to adjust for the massive loss in profits. They're also overly reliant on people's decision to travel by flight rather than the necessity. At the end of the day, flying is a luxury, and most people aren't going out of their way to go on a flight unless it's for work. For risk mitigation, they need to diversify inventory usage. This could mean that they take these planes that were previously passenger flights and they utilize them to transport cargo, perhaps. They also need to reevaluate the financial feasibility of low usage markets. So as we know, the global aircrafts are intertwined into markets all across the globe, and some of these are less profitable than others. For instance, the most flights in the US travel through Atlanta every year. This means that perhaps they need to look at eliminating less profitable airports, such as those in the Midwest or less utilized regions. They also need to aggregate the demand of all potential services that they can provide. This means that they'll be able to pool the demand of all the services, and it'll allow them to minimize the uncertainty that they face going forward. And once they're able to do this, they'll be able to have a deeper understanding of their current offerings, whether it be cargo, passenger flights, and the different levels that are available within each of those flights. And it'll allow them to find the areas that are least profitable and eliminate them going forward.
As a result, we're going to talk about strategic decisions of aerospace supply chain. So the grounding of aircraft has put a brake on demand for new parts, replacement spares for aircraft and engines, meaning a huge revenue slump and shortage of cash for many smaller suppliers, while at the same time, large numbers of skilled aerospace workers have been furloughed and may never return to their former jobs. As a result, we can see one of three events happen within these suppliers. First, we can see more suppliers do work in-house rather than outsourcing or relying on other suppliers. Results of insourcing lead to decrease in fixed costs, maximizing use of existing equipment, as well as maximization of using skilled workers in their own companies. Another event is that companies and suppliers can decide to restructure or right-size the company. This will adjust production and labor capacity and costs based on the new expected production rate. Last but not least, suppliers can consolidate with one another. We can see how consolidation can happen amongst the suppliers within the aerospace supply chain. We want to emphasize the consolidation scenario because this is a big one happening, especially as of recent events with COVID, when suppliers have not been able to keep up with costs and little demand. We are seeing that consolidation can be divided by tier 1 suppliers. So instead of having all tier 1 focusing on subsystems, what they'll do is they'll consolidate, acquire, or merge with either a tier 2, tier 3, or tier 4 supplier. The other type of consolidation that we see is consolidation by the OEMs. So what we see is that they'll start acquiring tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, or tier 4 suppliers to be able to fully do everything, all their subsystems, all their final productions in-house.
All right, so some recommendations. The first of which would be to lease more aircrafts. Leasing aircrafts allows for airlines to adjust for demand fluctuations. Some of the airline companies got caught out owning too much of their fleet, and this makes it challenging because they have a higher fixed cost that they have to account for. Next would be maintaining a flexible fleet capacity this goes hand in hand with leasing aircraft. When you lease them, you're on less of a hook in terms of the monetary cost it's gonna cost you. And some of these airlines aren't able to easily reutilize aircrafts for other things. And this just means that they end up sitting and aren't being utilized to bring any money in. We could also recommend to limit the amount of supplemental products required per flight. So this would be, some of the ancillary stuff we were talking earlier. Especially with consumer willingness at an all-time low to participate in aircrafts, I don't think that they can really afford to be offering these things each flight. But it should be noted that if the willingness to fly increases over time, these could then be reutilized as an incentive to try and convince customers to come back on, whether that be with a drink token or perhaps more incentivizing with no baggage fees.
Now, for more recommendations, as ticket sales decreased and airlines began to see a decrease in revenue, the demand for supplies all over the world increased. Airlines were unable to fill passenger seats, but the demand for the space underneath the seats increased with the demand of supplies, both impacted by the pandemic. The demand for cargo flights increased with the need of medical supplies, PPE, and packages. Instead of keeping planes grounded, airlines can use passenger planes for cargo-only flights. A pivot such as this one for these airlines would help keep airlines afloat by offering different services such as cargo-only flights to feed the increase in demand for what I mentioned before, PPE, medical supplies, food, everyday cleaning items, and even COVID tests. Even though cargo-only flights do not replace revenue lost, some airlines who have switched to using passenger planes for cargo are seeing profits. These airlines are Asian Airlines, Korean Air, and Asiana. Korean Air reported a profit of $12.2 million, even though their sales were down by 44%. Asiana reported a profit of $96.9 million, even though their sales were down by 45%.
With the lockdown, there's a sharp decline in world trade and the collapse of global supply chains are being recorded. This trend was counteracted by the growing demand for medical and protective goods. The commodities shifted significantly during the crisis. So some key points to know, commercial aircraft producers are definitely expecting a decrease in the order, but there's a lot of similarities between aerospace, defense, and medical device markets. So one recommendation that was suggested was using the existing machinery and manufacturing processes to become part of this medical device industry. We have attached a link here to Virgin Orbit, and they're a company that works in the aerospace industry. What they used to do is they used to make rocket ships, but because of COVID-19, they shifted and now they're making medical ventilators. So if you click on the link, you can see a short clip. Today's aerospace supply chain is complex, global, and more vulnerable than ever. Lessons from the biggest aircraft companies such as Boeing and Airbus on severe supply chain disruptions on the next generation of aircraft models should not be ignored. In the capital-intensive aviation industry, an agile and resilient supply chain, aside from efficient production processes, merits the highest level of attention. Thank you, guys.